The sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon was nothing compared to the roar of rage that tore from Jonas Thorne's chest when he learned the woman carrying his child was being forced to marry another man. The year was 1878, and the high country of Montana Territory had been Jonas's home for the better part of 6 years. He had carved out an existence in the unforgiving wilderness, trapping beaver and hunting elk, his body hardened into layers of thick muscle from hauling timber and scaling cliffsides. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, often tied back with a strip of leather, and his beard was trimmed close enough to reveal the strong line of his jaw. At 28 years old, he was a man who needed nothing from civilization, or so he had convinced himself until he met Clara Bellamy. Clara had arrived in the mountain settlement of Pine Ridge the previous autumn, fleeing some trouble back east that she never fully explained. She was a soft-spoken woman with gentle brown eyes and auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire. Her figure was full and rounded, with generous curves that made her the target of unwanted attention from the rougher elements in town. She had found work as a maid at the boarding house, scrubbing floors and washing linens for pennies a day, grateful for any honest employment that would keep her fed through the harsh winter. Jonas had first seen her at the general store, struggling with a heavy sack of flour that the proprietor had carelessly dropped at her feet. Without a word, he had lifted it as though it weighed nothing and carried it back to the boarding house for her. She had thanked him with such genuine warmth that something in his chest had cracked open. He started finding excuses to come down from his cabin in the mountains, trading his furs more frequently than necessary, lingering in town on the slim chance he might see her again. Their courtship had been slow and careful, built on quiet conversations and stolen glances. Clara had been wary at first, uncertain of this massive man with his wild appearance and rough hands, but Jonas had been patient, gentle in a way that seemed impossible for someone his size. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadows and fresh venison when he knew the boarding house meals were thin. She mended his shirts and read to him from the newspapers that came up from Helena, her voice soft and melodic in the evening lamplight. By the time spring broke across the mountains, they had fallen deeply in love. Jonas had kissed her for the first time beside a waterfall, the spray creating rainbows in the afternoon sun, and she had melted into his arms as though she had been waiting her whole life for that moment. They had made love in his cabin on a night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Clara gasping his name as he moved inside her with a tenderness that belied his powerful frame. She had cried afterward, telling him she had never known a man could be so kind. Jonas had planned to marry her properly. He was saving money from his fur trade, dreaming of building a larger cabin where they could raise a family. But then Clara had discovered she was pregnant, and everything had changed in the worst possible way. The trouble started when Beauregard Ashford arrived in Pine Ridge. Ashford was a cattle baron from Texas who had come north with a herd of longhorns and pockets full of money, looking to establish a ranch empire in Montana Territory. He was 35 years old, handsome in a polished way that Jonas despised, with slicked back blonde hair and tailored suits that must have cost more than most men earned in a year. He purchased a massive spread of land outside town and began constructing a ranch house that looked more like a mansion, complete with imported furniture and crystal chandeliers. Ashford had seen Clara at the boarding house and decided he wanted her. It did not matter to him that she loved another man. It did not matter that she was already carrying another man's child. What mattered to Beauregard Ashford was that he always got what he wanted, and he wanted Clara Bellamy as his wife. The pressure had been relentless. Ashford had bought the boarding house outright, becoming Clara's employer. He had offered her a position as head of his household staff, with wages that seemed astronomical to a woman who had been living on scraps. When she refused, he changed tactics. He began spreading rumors about Jonas, calling him a savage, suggesting he was dangerous and unstable. He convinced the town sheriff that Jonas was poaching on private land, though everyone knew the accusations were false. Then came the final blow. Ashford had discovered Clara's pregnancy and gone to her with an ultimatum disguised as generosity. He would marry her, give her child his name and legitimacy, provide a life of comfort and security. If she refused, he would ensure that Jonas was arrested and hanged for crimes Ashford would manufacture from whole cloth. He had the money and influence to make it happen, and they both knew it. Clara had tried to get word to Jonas, but Ashford had her watched constantly. When Jonas came down from the mountains 2 weeks later with a load of pelts to trade, he found the boarding house empty of her presence. The other maids told him in frightened whispers what had happened. Clara had been moved to the Ashford ranch. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, just 3 days away. Jonas had felt something break inside him, a howl of fury and despair that sent him racing to the ranch. But Ashford's hired guns had been waiting, 6 men with rifles who turned him back at the property line, with warnings that next time they would shoot. He had seen Clara briefly at an upstairs window, her face pale and drawn, one hand pressed to the slight swell of her belly. Their eyes had met across the distance, and he had seen the anguish in her expression before she disappeared back into the house. For 2 days, Jonas had haunted the mountains above the ranch, watching through his spyglass as preparations were made for the wedding. A preacher arrived from Helena. Guests began showing up, wealthy ranchers and businessmen from across the territory. A massive tent was erected on the lawn, decorated with white ribbons and flowers that must have been shipped from somewhere far away. It was obscene, this display of wealth and power, all designed to trap the woman he loved. Now it was Saturday morning, and Jonas was making his final preparations. He had spent the previous night cleaning his guns and sharpening his knife, though he hoped violence would not be necessary. His plan was simple and desperate: ride down during the ceremony, take Clara, and disappear into the mountains where Ashford's hired thugs would never find them. It was the act of a madman, but Jonas no longer cared about sanity or safety. He cared only about Clara and the child she carried, his child, the family that was being stolen from him by a rich man's greed. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Della, and checked his weapons one final time. His rifle was loaded and secured in its scabbard. His Colt revolver sat heavy on his hip. He wore his best clothes, which were still rough by town standards: clean buckskin pants, a dark cotton shirt, his leather coat. He tied his hair back firmly and took a long drink of water from the stream behind his cabin. The ride down to the Ashford ranch took 3 hours, following game trails that kept him hidden from the main roads. As he drew closer, he could hear music drifting up from the valley, a string quartet playing something formal and lifeless. His jaw clenched so hard, his teeth ached. He left Della tied in a grove of aspen trees about a quarter-mile from the ranch house and made his way forward on foot, using the cover of ornamental gardens and outbuildings to stay hidden. The wedding was taking place on the main lawn, with perhaps 50 guests seated in neat rows facing a flower-draped arch. He could see the preacher standing beneath the arch, Bible in hand, and Beauregard Ashford standing beside him in an expensive gray suit, looking smug and self-satisfied. Then the music changed, and Clara appeared. She walked from the house, flanked by 2 of Ashford's men disguised as ushers, but Jonas knew what they really were: guards ensuring she did not run. She wore a white dress that must have cost a fortune, the fabric shimmering in the late morning sun. Her hair was elaborately styled, decorated with orange blossoms and pearls. She looked beautiful and absolutely miserable, her face a mask of resigned despair as she moved slowly toward the arch. Jonas felt his heart shatter and reform in the same instant, hardening into something fierce and unbreakable. He moved quickly through the last of the cover, emerging at the back of the assembled guests. A few people gasped as they noticed him, this massive bearded man in rough clothing appearing like a specter at their fancy wedding. Clara had reached the arch and turned to face Ashford, but she had not yet taken his hand. The preacher was beginning his opening remarks when Jonas's voice rang out across the lawn, deep and commanding. "Stop this wedding." The music died abruptly. Heads whipped around. Ashford's face went red with fury as he recognized Jonas. The hired guns stationed around the perimeter started reaching for their weapons, but Jonas already had his hand on his Colt, and his reputation as a man dangerous to cross made them hesitate. "This is a private ceremony," Ashford snarled. "You are trespassing. Men, remove him." But Jonas was already walking forward, his gaze locked on Clara. Her eyes had gone wide, filled with a desperate hope that broke and mended his heart in equal measure. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence, "you do not have to do this." "She is here of her own free will," Ashford snapped, though everyone there could hear the lie in his words. "We are about to be married. Leave now, or I will have you shot like the dog you are." Jonas stopped about 10 feet from the arch, his muscles coiled and ready for whatever came next. "Clara is carrying my child. She loves me, not you. This whole thing is built on threats and lies, and every person here knows it." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several guests looked uncomfortable, clearly aware that something was not right about this hasty marriage. But others, Ashford's business associates and fellow wealthy landowners, merely looked annoyed at the interruption. "You have no proof of any of that," Ashford said coldly. "You are a delusional mountain man making wild accusations against your betters. Clara, tell him you chose to marry me." All eyes turned to Clara. She stood frozen beneath the arch, her hands trembling where they clutched a bouquet of white roses. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining the carefully applied cosmetics. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Jonas felt fear claw at his throat. What if Ashford's pressure had been too much? What if she had somehow convinced herself this was the right choice? Then Clara dropped the bouquet and turned to face Ashford, her voice shaking but clear. "I love Jonas. I've only ever loved Jonas. You threatened to have him killed if I did not agree to this wedding. You bought me like property and tried to make me grateful for it. I do not want to marry you. I never wanted to marry you." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Ashford's face went from red to purple. "You ungrateful little nobody," he hissed, his carefully maintained facade cracking. "I was giving you everything, respectability, wealth, a future for your bastard child, and you would throw it away for this savage?" "Watch your mouth," Jonas growled, taking another step forward. His hands had curled into fists the size of anvils. "You talk about Clara like that again. I will not care how many guns you have pointing at me." "Jonas, please," Clara said, stepping away from Ashford and moving toward him. The two guards tried to grab her arms, but she twisted free with surprising strength. "Please, let us just go. I do not want anyone to die over this." "Nobody's going anywhere," Ashford said, and suddenly there were guns being drawn all around the lawn. His hired men had moved into position, at least 8 of them with rifles trained on Jonas. "You broke onto my property, made threats, and attempted to disrupt a legal marriage. That is enough to justify killing you where you stand." Jonas's mind raced, calculating odds and angles. He could draw and fire, probably take down 3 or 4 of them before they got him. But then Clara would be alone with Ashford, and his child would grow up without ever knowing its father. That was unacceptable. "You are not going to shoot me in front of all these witnesses," Jonas said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Half these people are already uncomfortable with how you forced Clara into this. You kill me here, in cold blood, and you will have questions to answer even your money cannot buy off." Ashford's eyes narrowed, calculating. Jonas was right, and they both knew it. Shooting an unarmed man at a wedding in front of dozens of respected citizens would be impossible to explain away, no matter how much influence Ashford had. "Fine," Ashford said slowly. "Leave now, and I will let you live. But Clara stays. She agreed to marry me in front of witnesses, and that contract will be honored." "I agreed under duress," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. She had reached Jonas's side and immediately pressed herself against him, her smaller frame fitting perfectly against his bulk. His arm came around her shoulders automatically, protective and possessive. "Any lawyer would tell you such an agreement is not binding." "Lawyers are expensive," Ashford said with a cold smile, "and I can afford better ones than you ever could. Plus, you signed employment contracts with me when you moved into this house. Those give me certain rights over your time and actions. You try to leave, I will sue you for breach of contract and theft of the property I have already given you. Those charges will stick, and you will end up in prison. Is that what you want for your child? A mother in jail and a father dead in the mountains?" Clara's face went pale. Jonas felt her begin to tremble. Ashford had clearly thought this through from every angle, building a web of legal and financial traps that would be nearly impossible for people with no resources to escape. But Jonas had not lived 6 years alone in the mountains without learning a few things about survival and strategy. "What do you really want here, Ashford?" he asked quietly. "Because it seems to me you are working awfully hard to keep a woman who does not want you. That is going to make for a pretty miserable marriage." "What I want is none of your concern," Ashford snapped. "I think it is, actually." Jonas's mind was working quickly now, putting pieces together. "You came here from Texas, bought up a bunch of land, built this big house. You're trying to establish yourself as a respectable Montana rancher, maybe get into politics. But there is something in your past you are running from, is that it? Some scandal back in Texas that would ruin you if it came out? He was guessing, but the way Ashford's face went carefully blank told Jonas he had struck close to the truth. You needed a wife, someone respectable and controllable to complete the picture of the upstanding citizen you were pretending to be. Clara was convenient, pretty, grateful enough to be manageable, and already pregnant, so you would have an instant heir without anyone asking awkward questions about your own capabilities in that department. Several people in the crowd gasped. Ashford's hand twitched toward the gun at his own hip. You are dead, he said flatly. I do not care about witnesses. You are a dead man. Maybe, Jonas acknowledged, but I spent the last 2 days writing down everything I know about you, including some interesting stories I heard from a couple of your hired hands who were loose-lipped when drunk. I left those papers with someone who will mail them to every newspaper between here and Texas if I do not come back to collect them by sunset. You kill me, and whatever you are hiding comes out anyway. This was a complete bluff. Jonas had no such papers and no damaging information. But Ashford did not know that, and the fear that flashed across his face confirmed Jonas's suspicions about secrets worth hiding. The silence stretched out, tense and dangerous. Around them, the wedding guests were whispering frantically, the carefully orchestrated event collapsing into social chaos. Several people had already stood up and were edging toward their carriages, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Finally, an older woman in an expensive purple dress stood up and addressed Ashford directly. Beauregard, I have known your family for 20 years. If you are truly forcing this girl to marry you through threats and coercion, I want no part of it. That is not civilized behavior, no matter what your business interests might be. Other voices joined hers, mostly the women, expressing discomfort and disapproval. Jonas felt a surge of hope. Public opinion might be the lever they needed. Ashford looked around at his crumbling social standing and made a visible effort to control himself. Fine, he said through clenched teeth. Clara, you want to go live in a dirt cabin with this savage, bearing his children and scrubbing his floors until you are old and used up? Be my guest. But you leave here with nothing. The clothes on your back are mine. Any wages you think you are owed, I keep for the inconvenience of your breaking your employment contract. And both of you get out of Montana territory. I have friends in every town between here and Canada. I catch sight of either of you again, I will make sure you regret it. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was far better than Jonas had dared hope for. Clara clutched his arm. Jonas, she asked softly, can we really just leave? We can go anywhere you want, he said firmly. Oregon, California, maybe down to Wyoming. Plenty of places where we can start fresh. She looked up at him, her brown eyes swimming with tears and relief and love so profound, it stole his breath. Then let us go, now, before he changes his mind. Jonas nodded and began backing away, keeping Clara close and his eyes on Ashford and the hired guns. Nobody moved to stop them. The guests parted like a river around rocks, some looking relieved, others scandalized, all of them clearly eager for this disaster of a wedding to be over. They made it to the grove, where Della waited without incident. Jonas lifted Clara onto the horse as though she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. She leaned back against his chest and he wrapped one arm around her waist, feeling the small but definite swell of her pregnant belly against his forearm. His child, their child. Hold on tight, he murmured against her ear, and then he urged Della into a gallop, heading up into the mountains where he knew every trail and hidden valley, where no hired guns would be able to follow. They rode hard for several hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the Ashford ranch. Jonas took them deep into the high country, following paths that were barely more than suggestions through the dense pine forest. Clara clung to him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back. He could feel her exhaustion, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to bone-deep weariness. Finally, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, Jonas guided Della to a small meadow he knew, ringed by tall trees and bisected by a clear stream. There was a rock overhang at one end that would provide shelter, and the grass was thick and green, dotted with wildflowers. We will camp here tonight, he said, helping Clara down from the horse. Her legs were unsteady, and he caught her easily, holding her until she found her balance. Are you all right? Are you hurt? No, I'm just tired, she said, but she was smiling up at him with such radiant happiness that he felt his chest tighten. Jonas, you came for me. You actually came and took me away from there. Of course I did, he said gruffly, cupping her face in his large calloused hands. Did you think I would let him have you? Let him raise my child and keep you prisoner in that house? I was afraid, she admitted. Ashford said terrible things about what he would do to you if I did not cooperate. He said he would have you killed and make it look like an accident. I could not bear that thought, Jonas. I thought maybe it would be better if I just went through with it. At least then you would be safe. I would rather die than live knowing I lost you, Jonas said fiercely. He leaned down and kissed her, hard and desperate, pouring all his fear and relief and love into that connection. Clara responded with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt as she pulled him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said quietly. I should have said it more. I should have married you the first time you told me you were pregnant. I wasted time trying to save up money for a bigger cabin and a proper ring, and I almost lost you because of it. You did not waste anything, Clara said, tears slipping down her cheeks. And you did not lose me. I am right here, and I am never leaving you. I love you, Jonas Thorne, more than I have words to express. He kissed her again, gentler this time, a promise rather than a claim. Then he forced himself to step back and focus on practical matters. I need to set up camp and get a fire going. You should rest. It has been a long day. Clara nodded, but did not move far, settling herself on a relatively flat rock near where he began building the fire. She watched him work, her expression soft and content despite their circumstances. Jonas moved with efficient grace, gathering deadwood and kindling, striking sparks from his flint until the fire caught and began to grow. He unsaddled Della and rubbed her down, then let her graze on the meadow grass while he set up their simple camp. He had supplies in his saddlebags, dried venison, hardtack, a small pot for boiling water, blankets, and a canvas tarp. Not much, but enough to keep them alive and reasonably comfortable. He heated water and made a simple stew with the dried meat and some wild onions he found growing near the stream. Clara ate hungrily, clearly having been too nervous to take much food at the ranch that morning. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead, Jonas spread out their blankets beneath the rock overhang and helped Clara settle into them. She was wearing that ridiculously expensive wedding dress, now dusty and torn from the ride. I should have grabbed you some different clothes, he said ruefully. That thing is not practical for mountain living. Clara laughed, a bright sound that made his heart sing. I do not care if I have to wear this dress until it falls apart in rags. I am free, Jonas. We are together. Nothing else matters. He lay down beside her and pulled her into his arms, arranging the blankets around them both. Clara nestled against his chest, her pregnant belly pressed against his side, her head tucked perfectly under his chin. The fire crackled nearby, providing warmth and a soft golden light. What do we do now? Clara asked softly. Ashford told us to leave Montana Territory. Do you really think we should go? Jonas considered this carefully. I think we should head west, at least for a while. Oregon is opening up, plenty of land and opportunity, and it is far enough from Ashford's influence that we would not have to keep looking over our shoulders. Oregon, Clara repeated, testing the word. I have heard it is beautiful there. It is supposed to be, Jonas agreed. Green valleys, forests, good farmland, not as harsh as these mountains, especially not with winter coming. It would be a better place to raise a baby. Clara's hand moved to her belly, spreading protectively over the small swell. I am 4 months along now, she said. The baby will come in early winter, probably December. I would like to be settled somewhere safe before then. We will be, Jonas promised. I have some money saved from my trapping, not a lot, but enough to get us to Oregon and buy some basic supplies. Once we are there, I can find work. I am strong, and I know how to hunt and build. We will make it work. I know we will, Clara said with complete confidence. I'm not afraid of hard work, Jonas. I grew up poor, spent my whole life scrubbing and cleaning for other people. As long as I am with you, as long as our baby is safe, I can endure anything. He tightened his arms around her, overwhelmed by the depth of his feelings for this woman. She was so much stronger than she looked, so brave and resilient. You will never have to endure the kind of treatment Ashford was planning, he said fiercely. You are not a servant or a possession. You are the woman I love, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know how precious you are." Clara tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Make love to me," she whispered. "I need to feel you, need to know this is really real, and not some dream I am going to wake up from." Jonas needed no further encouragement. He kissed her deeply, his hands roaming over her body with reverent care. He was mindful of her pregnancy, gentle as he helped her out of the complicated wedding dress, unlacing and unbuttoning until she was bare beneath the blankets. His own clothes followed quickly, and then they were skin to skin, the heat between them building into something fierce and necessary. He entered her slowly, carefully, and Clara gasped his name like a prayer. They moved together with a rhythm perfected over months of stolen nights, their bodies knowing each other with intimate familiarity. Jonas was acutely aware of her changed shape, the soft swell of her belly between them, the slight additional fullness of her breasts. It made him feel fiercely protective and deeply aroused in equal measure. Clara clung to him, her nails digging into the thick muscles of his shoulders as he drove her higher and higher. When she came apart in his arms, crying out his name to the indifferent stars, he followed her over that edge, spilling himself deep inside her with a groan of profound satisfaction. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the blankets, the mountain air cool on their heated skin. Jonas pulled Clara close, draping his body partially over hers in an instinctive gesture of protection. She sighed contentedly and pressed a kiss to his collarbone. "I could live like this forever," she murmured drowsily. "Just you and me and the wilderness." "Eventually the baby will make 3, Jonas pointed out with a smile, "and I'm hoping for more after that if you are willing." "I would love to have a whole house full of children with you," Clara said. "Strong sons who look like their father, maybe a daughter or 2 with my coloring. A real family, built on love instead of obligation or fear." "That sounds perfect," Jonas agreed. His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing. "I am going to marry you properly as soon as we find a preacher who will do it. I want you to have my name, want everyone to know you are mine, and I am yours." "I am already yours," Clara said softly. "I have been since the first day you carried that flour sack for me. But yes, I would very much like to be your wife in the eyes of the law and God." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and the quiet sounds of the wilderness, safe for the moment from the dangers and complications of the civilized world. The journey to Oregon took 6 weeks, following the old emigrant trails west and south through Idaho territory. Jonas kept them off the main roads as much as possible, wary of running into anyone connected to Ashford or his network of business associates. They traveled slowly, mindful of Clara's pregnancy and the need to rest frequently. Jonas proved to be an excellent guide and provider. He hunted game to supplement their supplies, brought down deer and rabbits with his rifle, or trapped fish from the streams they passed. He found edible plants and showed Clara which berries were safe to eat. At night, he built shelters from branches and canvas, keeping them dry and warm even when storms rolled through. Clara did her part, cooking their meals over campfires and managing their limited supplies with careful efficiency. Her belly grew steadily rounder, and sometimes Jonas would catch her talking quietly to the child, telling stories about where they were going and the life they would build together. It made his heart ache with love every time. They passed through small settlements occasionally, stopping to buy necessary supplies and gather information about the trail ahead. In a town called Salmon River, Jonas found a circuit preacher who agreed to marry them. The ceremony was held in a simple whitewashed church, with only the preacher's wife and a curious shopkeeper as witnesses, but Clara glowed with happiness as Jonas slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, purchased with the last of his savings. "I am Clara Thorne now," she said wonderingly afterward, studying the ring on her hand. "Your wife, truly and legally." "Mrs. Thorne," Jonas agreed, pulling her into a kiss that made the preacher's wife blush and look away. "Mine in every way that matters." They continued west, following the Snake River through increasingly green and fertile country. The harsh mountains of Montana gave way to rolling hills and finally to the lush valleys of Oregon. By the time they reached the Willamette Valley in mid-October, Clara was visibly pregnant, her belly round and prominent beneath her travel-worn clothes. The valley was everything Jonas had hoped for: rich, dark soil, abundant water, forests full of timber, and land that could be claimed for practically nothing under the Homestead Act. They filed a claim on 160 acres near a settlement called Corvallis, land that included a mix of forest and meadow with a small creek running through it. Jonas immediately set to work building them a home. He felled trees and hewn logs, working from dawn to dusk with the desperate energy of a man who knew winter was coming and his wife would need shelter when she gave birth. Other settlers in the area, recognizing a family in need, came to help. They raised the walls and roof in a series of barn-raising events, and several women brought Clara supplies: baby clothes, blankets, jars of preserved food, practical gifts from people who understood frontier hardship. Clara made the cabin into a home with whatever materials she could find. She sewed curtains from flour sacks and built furniture from crates. She planted a small garden of winter vegetables, hopeful they would yield something before the first frost. She was tireless despite her advancing pregnancy, driven by the same need Jonas felt to build something stable and safe for their coming child. By the time the first snow fell in early December, they had a snug cabin with a good fireplace, a barn for the animals Jonas had traded for, and a pantry stocked with enough food to last through winter. Clara was enormous now, her belly so round that Jonas worried constantly about her comfort. She laughed at his fussing but allowed him to help her with tasks that had become difficult, like reaching things on high shelves or lifting heavy pots. The baby came on a cold night in the third week of December, just as a winter storm was howling outside. Jonas had fetched the midwife, a tough German woman named Mrs. Schultz, who ran a boarding house in Corvallis, and then found himself banned from his own bedroom while the women did their mysterious work. He paced the main room of the cabin, jumping at every cry or sound that came from behind the closed door. It seemed to go on forever, Clara's laboring cries tearing at his heart, making him feel helpless and frantic. He had faced down bears and mountain lions, had survived falls and injuries that should have killed him, but nothing had prepared him for the terror of hearing the woman he loved in pain while being unable to help her. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably only 8 hours, he heard a different cry, high and wavering and unmistakably new. The baby. Mrs. Schultz emerged a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a cloth and smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Thorne, a big, healthy boy with a set of lungs on him. Your wife did very well." Jonas barely heard the words. He was already pushing past the midwife into the bedroom, his eyes searching desperately for Clara. She was propped up in their bed, looking exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat and her face glowing with joy. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in blankets, and as Jonas approached, she pulled back the fabric to reveal a tiny red face, wrinkled and angry-looking, with a surprising amount of dark hair. "Jonas, meet your son," Clara said softly. He sank down on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the baby's impossibly small head. "He is perfect," Jonas whispered, his voice breaking. "You are perfect, both of you." The baby, disturbed by the touch, opened his eyes and seemed to stare directly at Jonas with a dark, unfocused gaze. Something in Jonas's chest cracked open completely, a flood of love and protectiveness so intense it was almost painful. "What should we name him?" Clara asked. Jonas thought for a moment, considering the journey that had brought them here. "How about Samuel? It means asked of God, or heard by God. Seems fitting considering I prayed every day that we would make it here safe, that you and the baby would be all right." "Samuel Thorne," Clara repeated, testing the name. "I love it. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world, little one." Baby Samuel responded by yawning widely and then starting to root against Clara's chest, clearly hungry. Mrs. Schultz, who had followed Jonas into the room, chuckled. "That's my cue to show you how to nurse, Mrs. Thorne. Mr. Thorne, why do not you give us a few minutes?" Jonas reluctantly retreated to the main room, but his heart was soaring. He was a father. He had a son. Clara was safe and healthy. They had a home and a future stretching out before them. After all the fear and uncertainty, all the desperate gambles and narrow escapes, they had actually made it. The first months of Samuel's life were challenging but joyful. Jonas threw himself into improving their homestead, clearing land for crops, building better fences, making plans for expansion. Clara recovered from the birth quickly and took to motherhood with natural grace, nursing Samuel and singing him soft lullabies while Jonas worked outside. Winter gave way to spring, and the Willamette Valley burst into spectacular bloom. Jonas planted their first crops, wheat and corn and vegetables, learning as he went from more experienced farmers. Clara tended a growing garden and began raising chickens, selling eggs in town for extra money. Samuel grew from a newborn to a chubby, smiling baby who clearly recognized his parents and gurgled happily when Jonas came in from the fields. Life was hard, make no mistake. Farming was backbreaking work, and they were starting from nothing. There were days when Jonas collapsed into bed barely able to move, muscles screaming from the labor. There were nights when Samuel would not stop crying, and Clara would weep from exhaustion. Money was always tight, and they had to make do with very little. But they were happy, deeply, profoundly happy in a way that Jonas had never imagined possible. Every morning he woke up next to Clara, every evening he held his son, every meal they shared at their rough wooden table felt like a miracle. This was what he had fought for at that interrupted wedding, what he had been willing to die for. A life built on love rather than coercion, a family that was truly his. One evening in late spring, after Samuel had been put to bed and they had finished their evening chores, Jonas and Clara sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and rose. Clara was nestled against his side, fitting perfectly under his arm as she always had. "I have been thinking," Clara said softly, "about Ashford and what he tried to do to us." Jonas tensed slightly. They had not spoken much about Beauregard Ashford since arriving in Oregon, both of them preferring to focus on building their new life rather than dwelling on what they had escaped. "What about him?" "I have been thinking that I should pity him," Clara said thoughtfully. "He had so much wealth, so much power, and he was still so miserable that he had to try to force someone to love him. What a sad, small life that must be." Jonas considered this, then nodded slowly. "You are a better person than I am." "I mostly just hope his secrets came out and ruined him," Clara laughed softly. "All right, I confess I have had some of those thoughts too, but mostly I just feel grateful. Grateful that you came for me, grateful that we escaped, grateful for this life we are building." "I am grateful too," Jonas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Every single day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of their homestead, the chickens settling in their coop, their horse moving around in the barn, the creek burbling in the distance. It was peaceful in a way that settled deep into Jonas's bones. "I want more children," Clara said suddenly. "I know Samuel is only 6 months old, and I know we are still struggling to get established here. But I want a big family, Jonas. I want this house full of children and love and noise." Jonas smiled against her hair. "How many are you thinking?" "I do not know. 4? 5? However many God sees fit to bless us with." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Is that too many? Can we manage that?" "We can manage anything together," Jonas said firmly. He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You want 5 children, I will give you 5 children. You want 10, we will figure that out too. Whatever makes you happy, Clara." She turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and deep and full of promise. "You make me happy," she murmured against his lips. "Everything else is just extra." The years that followed proved both challenging and blessed. Clara did indeed have more children. A daughter named Elizabeth born in 1880, another son they named Thomas in 1882, twin girls named Mary and Margaret in 1884, and a final daughter named Hope in 1887. Their cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, rooms added as needed and finances allowed. Jonas became a successful farmer, his natural strength and determination paying off as he cleared more land and brought in better harvests each year. He was known throughout the area as a man of his word, honest in his dealings and willing to help neighbors in need. People respected him, though some still found him intimidating with his massive build and rough appearance. Clara thrived as a mother and homemaker, managing their large household with efficient grace. She taught all the children to read and write, supplementing their education with lessons from the small schoolhouse that was eventually built in Corvallis. She became known for her kindness, always ready with a meal for a struggling family or help for a sick neighbor. Samuel grew into a strong, serious boy who idolized his father and followed him everywhere, learning to hunt and farm and care for animals. Elizabeth was bright and curious, constantly asking questions and reading every book she could get her hands on. Thomas was the wild one, always getting into trouble and needing rescue from trees or creeks. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in a language only they understood. And Hope, the baby, was sunny and affectionate, bringing joy to everyone around her. Life was not without its difficulties. There were crop failures and illnesses, injuries and setbacks. They lost their barn to a fire in 1885 and had to rebuild from scratch. Thomas broke his arm, falling out of a tree, and scared them all half to death. One winter was so harsh that they nearly ran out of food, and Jonas had to hunt in dangerous conditions to keep the family fed. But through it all, Jonas and Clara's love never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared struggles and triumphs. They still stole moments alone when they could, escaping to the creek or the barn to hold each other and remember the early days when it had been just the two of them against the world. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1886, Jonas gave Clara a gift he had been working on in secret, a rocking chair carved from oak with their initials and wedding date carved into the back. "For you to sit in when you are old and gray," he said, "watching our grandchildren play in the yard." Clara had cried and kissed him and declared it the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. She used that chair to rock baby Hope to sleep every night and later to sit and sew while watching the older children play. They never heard from Beauregard Ashford again. Jonas did make some quiet inquiries through a lawyer in Corvallis, curious whether his bluff about damaging information had ever come to light. What he learned was that Ashford had indeed left Montana Territory in 1879, selling his ranch at a loss and disappearing back to Texas. Rumors suggested financial scandals and possible criminal charges, but nothing concrete was ever confirmed. Jonas chose to take satisfaction in knowing the man had not prospered after trying to steal Clara and then let it go completely. As the children grew older and more independent, Jonas and Clara found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. They would take walks in the evening after dinner, hand in hand, talking about their hopes for the children's futures, or simply enjoying the peaceful beauty of the land they had claimed. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one such evening, when Samuel was 16 and courting a girl from town, when Elizabeth was planning to attend the new college in Eugene, when the house was full of noise and chaos and life. "Do you ever wish you had stayed in the mountains, living that simple life without all this responsibility?" Jonas looked at her in genuine surprise. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me, Clara. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. I would interrupt 100 weddings, ride 1,000 miles, face any danger if it meant ending up here with you." Clara smiled, that same radiant expression she had worn on the day he rescued her from Ashford's ceremony. "I love you, Jonas Thorne. I loved you when you were a rough mountain man bringing me wildflowers. I loved you when you burst into that wedding like an avenging angel. I loved you when Samuel was born, and I saw you cry for the first time. And I love you now, gray in your beard and lines around your eyes, still the strongest and kindest man I have ever known." "I love you too," Jonas said simply, pulling her close. "Always have, always will." They stood there as the sun set over their land, over the life they had built from nothing but determination and love. In the house behind them, their children were laughing and arguing and living their young lives with the fearless joy of those who had never known uncertainty or fear. It was everything Jonas had dreamed of during those desperate days when he thought he might lose Clara forever. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow as all lives do. Jonas's parents, whom he had been estranged from since leaving for the mountains years ago, made contact in 1889 and eventually came to visit, reconciling with their son and meeting their grandchildren for the first time. Clara's past remained largely a mystery, but Jonas never pressed her to share more than she was comfortable with, respecting her privacy. Samuel eventually married his sweetheart and took over much of the farming operation, showing the same dedication and strength his father had. Elizabeth did attend college and became a teacher, shocking some people with her modern ideas, but making her parents proud. Thomas settled down after a wild youth and became a skilled carpenter, building beautiful furniture that people traveled from miles around to purchase. The twins married brothers from a neighboring farm and lived within walking distance of each other, continuing their special bond. Hope grew into a talented artist whose paintings captured the beauty of Oregon in ways that took Jonas's breath away. Through it all, Jonas and Clara remained the center of their expanding family, the foundation on which everything else was built. They celebrated holidays and birthdays together, supported each other through losses and setbacks, and created a legacy of love and stability that would extend to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. On a warm summer evening in 1898, 20 years after that fateful interrupted wedding, Jonas and Clara sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel's 3 boys were chasing Thomas's 2 daughters around the garden, while Elizabeth's studious son read under a tree. The twins had provided 5 more grandchildren between them, and Hope was newly married and glowing with happiness. 13 grandchildren, Clara said contentedly, leaning back in her beloved rocking chair, with more probably on the way. Can you believe it, Jonas? All of this came from that day you burst into Ashford's wedding and demanded I come with you. Jonas chuckled, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. I would have burned down the whole ranch if that is what it took. Nothing was going to keep me from you. My hero, Clara teased gently, but her eyes were serious and full of love. You really were, you know. You saved me from a life of misery and gave me all of this instead. A real family, built on love and respect. I could never thank you enough. You gave me just as much, Jonas insisted. I was half wild before I met you, Clara. Living like an animal in the mountains, barely human, you civilized me, gave me a reason to be better, to build something lasting. We saved each other. She squeezed his hand, her wedding ring still gleaming on her finger after all these years. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the next generation of Thornes grow and play, secure in the knowledge that their love had created something beautiful and enduring. As the sun set over the Willamette Valley, painting the sky in those same golds and roses they had admired so many times before, Jonas reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them here. From mountain man and struggling maid to husband and wife, from desperate flight to established family, from that interrupted wedding to this moment of perfect peace. It had not been easy. They had faced dangers and hardships, uncertainty and fear. But they had faced it all together, and that had made all the difference. Their love had been forged in crisis and tempered by time, growing stronger rather than weaker as the years passed. What are you thinking about? Clara asked softly, noticing his thoughtful expression. Just that I am the luckiest man alive, Jonas said simply. I have everything I ever wanted right here. You, our children, our grandchildren, this land. It is more than I ever dreamed of having. We built something good here, Clara agreed, something worth all the struggle and sacrifice. As darkness fell and the grandchildren were called inside by their parents, Jonas and Clara remained on the porch a while longer, unwilling to let go of the perfect peace of the evening. Finally, as the stars began to appear overhead, Jonas stood and offered his hand to Clara, helping her up from her rocking chair with the same gentle care he had always shown her. Come to bed, Mrs. Thorne, he said softly. Tomorrow will bring more work and more chaos, but tonight let us just rest and be grateful for what we have. Clara took his hand and let him lead her inside, through the house they had built together, past the rooms where their children had grown up and their grandchildren now played. They prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of decades, and then climbed into the bed they had shared for 20 years. Jonas pulled Clara close, her body still fitting perfectly against his despite the changes time had brought to them both. She sighed contentedly and pressed a kiss to his shoulder. I love you, she whispered, as she did every night. I love you too, Jonas responded, as he did every night in return. And in the peaceful darkness of their bedroom, surrounded by the life they had built and the family they had created, Jonas Thorne and Clara Thorne drifted off to sleep, secure in a love that had survived every challenge and grown stronger for it. The story of how Jonas interrupted a rich rancher's wedding to steal back the pregnant woman he loved became something of a legend in their family, told and retold to each generation of grandchildren, The details became slightly exaggerated over time, as such stories do, but the essential truth remained that love had triumphed over money and power, that courage and devotion had won the day, and that from desperate circumstances had grown something beautiful and lasting. Their grandchildren would ask Jonas to tell the story over and over, wide-eyed with wonder at the idea of their gentle grandfather as a dangerous mountain man bursting into a wedding ceremony. And Jonas would oblige, though he always ended the story the same way, by looking at Clara with that same fierce love that had driven him to risk everything for her all those years ago. "The important thing is not how it started," he would tell the children. "The important thing is that we found each other, we fought for each other, and we built a life together based on love and respect. That is what really matters. That is what lasts." And Clara would smile at him from her rocking chair, her eyes still bright with the same devotion she had shown on that day when he came for her. And the grandchildren would run off to play, carrying with them the lesson that true love was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth building a whole life around. As the 19th century drew to a close and a new one beckoned, Jonas and Clara faced the future with the same courage and commitment that had seen them through everything else. They knew there would be more challenges ahead, more joys and sorrows to weather together. But they also knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, side by side, hand in hand, sustained by a love that had proven stronger than any obstacle. And in the end, that was the greatest triumph of all, not the land they had claimed or the family they had raised or the prosperity they had achieved, but simply that they had found each other and held on tight, refusing to let fear or circumstance or the machinations of cruel men tear them apart. In a hard world that often seemed designed to break people down, Jonas and Clara had built something unbreakable. They had created a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered and cherished by their descendants for generations to come. On a spring morning in 1900, as they stood together surveying the orchards Jonas had planted years ago, now mature and heavy with blossoms, Clara turned to her husband with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for coming for me, for building this life with me, for loving me so completely all these years." Jonas pulled her close, his strong arms still capable of making her feel safe and cherished even after decades together. "Thank you for being worth coming for," he responded, "for being strong enough to survive until I could get to you, for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who did not have much to offer except his whole heart." "Your whole heart was more than enough," Clara said. "It was everything." They kissed there among the blossoming apple trees, their bodies older, but their love as fresh and vital as it had been on that day, 22 years ago, when Jonas had burst into Beauregard Ashford's wedding and changed both their lives forever. Around them, the farm they had built buzzed with activity, their children and grandchildren working and playing, chickens clucking, horses whinnying, the sounds of a thriving homestead built on love and labor. It was a good life. A hard life, certainly, but a good one. Built on a foundation of courage and devotion, grown through years of partnership and commitment, and flourishing into something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined in those desperate early days. And as they walked back toward the house hand in hand, their steps slower now but still perfectly matched, Jonas Thorne and Clara Thorne knew with absolute certainty that they would do it all again without hesitation. Every moment of fear, every day of struggle, every challenge they had overcome, all of it had been worth it to create this life together. Their love story had started with an interrupted wedding and a daring escape into the mountains. It had continued through hardship and uncertainty, built a family and a legacy, and created something that would endure long after they were gone. And that, in the end, was the greatest testament to the power of true love. Not that it made life easy, but that it made life worth living, worth fighting for, worth building something lasting and beautiful despite all the obstacles. As the sun climbed higher in the Oregon sky, warming the fertile valley they called home, Jonas and Clara moved toward whatever the future held with the same courage and devotion that had sustained them through everything else. Together as they had always been. Together as they would always be. Forever united by a love that had proven itself in the crucible of hardship and emerged stronger, truer, and more precious than gold. Their story was complete, their victory absolute, their love eternal. And in the quiet moments before sleep each night, as Jonas held Clara close and felt the steady beat of her heart against his chest, he would offer up a prayer of gratitude for the life they had built and the love they had shared. It was more than he had ever dreamed possible, and exactly what he had been willing to die for on that day when he interrupted a rich rancher's wedding to steal back the woman he loved. In the end, love had conquered all, and that was the only ending that mattered.